We're on a roll now, guys. Let's join Mai in part one of our conversation together. Everybody out there in Disorderland, welcome back to the channel. I'm really excited today because we have our second collaboration in a row. I hope you guys enjoyed the last collaboration with Eden, but today I'm joined by Mai. Mai is a psychology student in Mexico. I'm actually in Mexico City right now, but Mai, you're a few hours south of Mexico City, right?
Yes, we're like 2 to 3 hours away.
2 to 3 hours
I'm in
away.
Puebla.
Yeah, so just a little too far to meet in person, but we're pretty close to each other at the moment. Anyway, so Maya is a psychology student. She reached out to me a few months ago based on the content of my channel, and she thought that we could have a good conversation. She thought that she'd like to get some things out there, and we had a conversation beforehand, and it went really well, so I invited her onto the channel. Welcome to the channel, Mai.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you for having me. Hi
Uh,
to everyone.
I'd like to start just by asking you what your connection to OCPD is.
Well, I was diagnosed with OCPD about a year and a half ago. By that time, I had already been diagnosed with anxiety and depression, and I was feeling a little bit stressed. I was stressed in that time, so I started going to a new psychiatrist, and he diagnosed me with OCD. I didn't know much about OCD in that time, so I started making research, and within the research, I found out about OCPD. And when I read about it, I felt like it was describing me perfectly,
Mm-hmm.
like all the rigid personality, all about feeling stressed for things that might not look stressful for other people.
Correct.
Um, Yes. So I realized that maybe I had this disorder, and I told my psychiatrist, and my psychiatrist didn't want to diagnose me with it because I think most psychiatrists, especially here in Mexico, they kind of believe that mm, making a diagnosis is not that easy, shouldn't be that easy, and they wait so much time to make it. So I looked for a different psychiatrist, and he diagnosed me with OCPD. And then when I realized that I did have OCPD, I started reading about it, learning about it, and caring about this group of people that have OCPD. What are their main needs, right? I started
Mm-hmm.
to get
Yeah.
involved in wanting to know what are our needs and how to make our world a little bit more OCPD friendly.
So, in your opening comments, you mentioned OCD. So, do you have an OCD diagnosis and OCPD diagnosis?
Yes, I was diagnosed with both things. And at the beginning, I think it's a little bit hard to understand and explain the difference, the main difference between them both. But as you educate yourself about these two disorders, you realize that they are actually pretty different.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean, I don't know how to say this, but one of the diagnoses that I enjoyed the most having was OCPD because I felt like there was something missing that doctors weren't seeing. And like
Right.
maybe OCPD was the last explanation that completely explained everything that was going on.
If you don't mind sharing, what diagnosis do you have today?
Well, I already recovered from depression,
Mm-hmm.
but right now I am diagnosed with generalized anxiety, OCD, OCPD. Also, I have ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
ADHD,
Yeah,
yes.
ADHD.
And and also I wasn't exactly diagnosed, but I was told that I had like certain characteristics of psychosis. So I'm taking antipsychotics just because doctors don't want it to develop even further. So I do have
Sure.
like a good number of diagnoses, but I think also it will make sense when we actually talk about the main subject of this video, will make a little bit
Sure.
more sense as to why there are so many diagnoses and
Yeah.
as to why there could be many diagnoses for one person.
So you were diagnosed, you said, about a year and a half ago with OCPD, and prior to that, OCD. And you said that you weren't familiar with OCD. So I have to imagine that you also probably weren't familiar with OCPD when you were diagnosed. Is that correct?
Yes, I didn't know at all that OCPD was a thing.
Hmm.
Actually, in that time, I hadn't begun to study psychology. I hadn't even started studying by myself because before starting the career, I started studying just because I liked it. But I hadn't at that time. That's why I didn't know it was a thing. So it took me by surprise.
By the way, just for my English speaking audience, what is obsessive compulsive personality disorder in Spanish?
It is trastorno de la personalidad obsesivo compulsivo.
Okay. And I knew that, but I couldn't pronounce it, so I made you do it. But today you're on the channel to discuss trauma and its role in OCPD. So instead of me grilling you on it, why don't I just let you take the floor and you can kind of introduce the topic yourself and why you wanted to come on the channel?
I was interested in trauma first. How it all started? Well, I was going on vacations. I was at the beach, and I was scrolling through YouTube, and I found this girl that has identity no dissociative identity disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was before it was known as multiple personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Now the name has changed, and I liked a lot her videos. I liked a lot the way that she talked about trauma. Like you said, she talked about it as a very matter of fact,
Mm-hmm.
as if it was something that simply happens. And I really liked it. So I started. At first, I didn't know why I liked it. I just knew that it was interesting. Maybe it was just that, an interest. But the time started passing by, and I started remembering things from my childhood, abuse that I had passed through, even physically, say, emotionally, even intellectual abuse. And I realized that maybe I was passing through something similar to her. I was having a very hard time finding out what exactly was wrong with me. Many people, many doctors had told me different disorders that I had, but there was something still that was missing, something that we weren't seeing, because even though the treatment was working, it wasn't completely working. There was something missing. So I started having flashbacks, just images that I didn't want in my head that would just come out and made me remember certain things of my past. And I realized that I had passed through a lot of trauma. So I started researching, and what I found out is trauma is not something that happens. Trauma is what happens to you afterwards, this traumatic event. So you have a traumatic event.
Mm-hmm.
The event by itself is not giving you the trauma, it's the interpretation that you give to that event. For example, for
Sure.
me, it might be very traumatic that my very best friend tells me a lie. But maybe for someone else, the same experience is not as traumatic and it's just like,
Sure.
well, why did she lie to me? And understandable. So we interpret our own situations, and our own brain, without knowing it, transforms it into trauma. Because the trauma, you can see it as a wound, as if your brain was hurt and your brain trying to heal himself makes a scar, and that
Mm-hmm.
scar is the trauma. So when you pass through traumatic events, especially in childhood, before the age 8, 9, and before that age, the personality that you have is not completely formed. It's a little bit like gas. It's not solid.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like flying around, and it's flexible. You can bend it if you have a lot of stress. So if you as a child that have a personality not completely formed have a lot of stress, your body gets used to the levels of cortisol in your brain, and your brain doesn't know what to do with that much cortisol because you're just a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Your brain doesn't know what to do. So what it does is that it splits the brain in different sections so that one section can consciously treat and process the trauma, and the other part can ignore the trauma and pretend that it didn't exist.
Hmm.
That's what happened to me, that I was consciously not knowing that I had a trauma, but somewhere back in my mind, a part of my brain did know it, and my brain was like looking for the right moment, to show me, like, look, this happened to you, but I'm just gonna tell you right now. I'm just gonna leave it on the table.
Hmm.
That's what brain does. um
So
the thing about
were you able to
yeah.
uncover the traumas on your own, or was this with the help of a therapist?
No, it was all on my own, but not complete. I didn't uncover trauma completely.
Hmm.
I can i can remember certain emotions that I used to feel, and I know that something happened. Like, I know I was hit when I was a kid, but I
Hmm.
don't remember exactly the day and moment when I was
Sure.
hit. I kind of remember it as a global thing. I do know that I was hit, and I remember I would feel terrible in that time, but I don't remember specifically moments. Also, something that happens with trauma is that your memory is a little blurry or has some spots that don't have information.
Hmm.
Also, what happens to me is that I do know that something happened, but I don't know when it happened. It could have happened 2 weeks ago or maybe 10 years ago, and I'm not really sure of exactly what happened. So, those kind of things are symptoms that we can have when you have a
Sure.
traumatic disorder, or a disorder that comes from trauma. So, I would like to talk about the symptoms, because I think that is one of the first things that make you realize that maybe you're passing through it. So, one of the most common symptoms is stress and anxiety. That's like main symptom. Why? Because your brain was used to always being on edge and always being careful and on stress all the time.
Hmm.
Right now, that your life might be a little bit calmer, your brain doesn't know what to do with the cortisol that is used to produce every day. So your brain still produces it every day. So you always believe that you always have to be on edge and prepare for
Sure. Yeah.
anything dangerous that might come to you. So that's one of the symptoms. Another of the symptoms is avoiding situations. You know,
Hmm.
and I think this has like a little link to OCPD, because you know that certain situations make you very uncomfortable,
Yeah,
and maybe you
absolutely.
don't know why,
Right.
but you try not to do them, of course, because you don't want to feel uncomfortable. But the thing with trauma is that the avoiding of those situations make your life less functionable. It's a
Hmm.
little bit harder for you to function completely in the way that you should, because you're avoiding many, many situations. For example, you might be avoiding at all talking to people. So you will never talk to people. And if you didn't have trauma, maybe you would avoid at a certain times of talking to people. But when you have trauma, it becomes a little bit of an obsession, those avoiding techniques, because you know that it really, really affects you.
Yeah,
Another thing,
there's some
yes.
pretty serious lengths people will go to avoid social situations. I'm sure a lot of people watching are very familiar with social anxiety, either because they experience it themselves or they have somebody in their life that they know of that has social anxiety. I just wanted to back up for a minute. I think that you did a really excellent job of explaining the difference between a traumatic event and what trauma is, and how it can kind of lay dormant and then pop up later on, and it can be really hard to know what's going on, I guess, in your head and in your life and with your actions and your thoughts and your behaviors, and your symptoms. And I think that as it relates to OCPD, it's an interesting topic because there's no general consensus as to exactly what causes obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So there are doctors that believe that this is something that is essentially inherited. This is something in your DNA, and you're going to have it regardless. Others that believe that it's more situational, and that what you're talking about, traumatic events causing trauma, and this can lead to a whole host of problems. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder is just one example on a long list of things that can happen if you experience traumatic events and end up suffering with trauma. So there's a lot of theories, I guess, surrounding obsessive compulsive personality disorder. I should just say OCPD. That's such a mouthful when you say the whole thing. But I am in the camp personally that it's likely to be a bit of both, but it does feel like it's more likely something that's happened to you, and because of maybe extenuating circumstances, or maybe the length of the traumatic event, or maybe it's a mix of, just your own personal personality, and then combine it with that traumatic event, and you end up developing these different neuroses, these different disorders that can be very crippling later on in life. But I think you did a really good job kind of just explaining that to the audience, so that they maybe are sitting there and thinking a little bit about their youth or their teenage years, and going back and trying to dissect that. I think the best thing to do is obviously dissect that with a therapist. And the other thing, I was kind of rambling a bit, because the other thing I wanted to mention was that I know the definition of trauma, but I think it, up until recently, it felt like more of an abstract idea, because most people do tend to think of trauma as the traumatic event itself, or as something that would be easily identifiable. And while going through my own personal treatment and speaking with my therapist, I uncovered kind of lots of little things that all kind of combined to create this trauma in my life that I couldn't identify. It took me, decades essentially to kind of uncover this. And I think that, again, there's a little bit of this stigma that's almost drilled into us. So when the therapist was presenting these ideas to me and saying, well, this was a traumatic event, and this was a traumatic event, and this was a traumatic event, and if you combine them all together, you're looking at a lot of trauma that you've been dealing with, or suppressing, or using unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with for all these years. And it was hard for me to accept that these were traumatic events, because they felt small on the surface. But again, like you said, you used the example of somebody lying to you. It's very situational. It's very much down to how you were raised, what your belief system is, your ideology, all of these things combine. And so there's no such thing as a traumatic event, in the sense that there's not one thing that you can say everybody would be traumatized by that. I'm thinking of I can't remember her name, but there was a surfer. I think she was pretty young, and she had, I want to say it was her arm that was bitten off by a shark. I don't know if you're familiar with that story. It's, I think, a few years
Yes.
old now. And you would think, okay, that is a traumatic event for sure. But for her, she loves surfing. She thought that's a once in a lifetime thing that's going to happen. I survived it, and she got right back out there as soon as it healed up, and she was on her surfboard. So you can't say definitively that. You would think for sure that's got to be a traumatic event, yet it wasn't. And then for me, I'm looking at these little moments in time and realizing that, it took a few sessions, maybe even more than a few sessions, for me to kind of agree that, okay, yeah, with the way I was raised, combined with the things that I was taught, combined with the culmination of all of these events together, that I was experiencing trauma. So I think everything you said is very, very pertinent, and I just kind of wanted to make it a little bit more personal. And again, thank you for that in-depth explanation. I'm kind of keeping track of the time, so I think right here would be a really good place to end part one of the video. So we'll stop right here, and we'll catch you guys in the next video. I hope you enjoyed the chat up to this point. Stick around though, as part 2 of our conversation will be uploaded here next week. See you then.